Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko ingarangi te whakapaparanga mai, engari no ototahi Aotearoa o. Ko Python New Zealand te hapori, ko Kelsey toku ingoa. Nā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. My name is Kelsey, and one of the reasons I've chosen to open with a pepeha is it is about introducing yourself in a manner that allows you to find connections between yourselves and those around you, which is something that this talk encourages you to think about. A rough translation is that I am of European descent. I was born and raised in Christchurch, New Zealand, and Python New Zealand is my community. I'm a senior software engineer working on the back end of cloud software as a service products using a variety of languages, but currently most of my time is spent in a mix of Python and Node.js. This talk draws from my own experiences and musings, having grown up as both a computer geek and a crafter, who ended up getting quite into programming and knitting about the same time, around 8 or 9 years ago now. As someone with ADHD, I find it quite helpful to keep my hands busy while I'm focusing elsewhere, and with knitting you even create something physical at the end, which is really satisfying sometimes. And it's a great hobby, but it can be really overwhelming to read patterns when you're getting started. And I realized that's the same way I found programs. They were really overwhelming. I could not understand what was going on until I spent some time understanding how it got broken down. And as I got more confident, I realized how similarly I think about them. If I'm trying to debug them, see where something has gone wrong, or if I'm trying to modify it to make it do something slightly different from what the original person wanted to do, even if that was past me. But should we really be surprised? Knitting patterns are kind of programs for your hands. If you follow the instructions correctly, you'll get the same output every time. And there's a lot of shared history between all sorts of fiber arts and computing. Early computing drew a lot, so we'll start by exploring that a little bit. So as you might know, computing has taken a lot of terms from elsewhere, physical items in our world that help us conceptualize what it is we're doing in this digital realm that we can't touch. Files, folders, desktops, and environments are all really common ones that you might think of. But some examples had really long lives in sewing and other fiber arts prior to their use in computing. For one example, when it comes to sewing, interfacing is an extra layer of fabric that gets used to help stabilize material, often in between two outer layers. It may be used for collars or button bands, and quilts for between the decorative front and the backing fabric. And there's many, many examples of this in historical garments, particularly in corsetry and dressmaking. These days we often use a more fusible interfacing, but the practice is still around. The way we use the term in programming is similar, although not quite the same, connecting different aspects of your program together, sometimes allowing things to work together in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. We also talk about binding variables, assigning things by attaching them to a name. In fiber arts, binding can be a narrow strip of fabric attached to an edge to tidy it up, or used to describe how you secure stitches at the end of your knitting. In both cases, it's about attaching things securely to ensure that they're actually behaving as you expect, which is where I suspect the term binding came in for variables. You are making sure that you know what this is called, you're using the same thing later on. But the one that I find most interesting to think about is threads. In programming, this is a way of dividing our program execution with individual threads working on separate tasks. But threads are also one of the most important things in fiber arts. You sew with a needle and thread, and fabric is woven from many threads in perpendicular directions known as the warp and the weft. I sometimes find it quite interesting to think about how much more work needed to go into every single item of clothing that was worn, with fabric being hand-woven and early looms being complex and laborious machines to use. They often had little boys who would go around and move all of the levers between every single pass of the weft because they needed someone nimble and quick, but it could be really dangerous as well. And that's one of the reasons why weaving had a very large amount of influence on early computing. Creating fabric is such an important task in so much of our lives. And it still is, despite technical advances and globalization disconnecting us from a lot of the work that goes into it. There are still people around the world that hand sew most of the clothes that you are wearing today. But of course, people are trying to make this easier for ourselves, and we have many times along the way. The most famous example of weaving's influence on computing is the jacquard loom and its punch cards. A loom works by keeping the longer warp threads in tension, with the weft being passed back and forth across. Basic weaving you may have done by hand in an arts and crafts class at some point, simply alternating over and under the entire way across. But weaving patterned fabric was done by having much more complicated combinations. This changes the dominant colour and/or texture, and it requires manually altering which of the threads are lifted at various points before each pass, as I mentioned. They often use small children to do this because you needed to get into the space. It would take a really long time to create any sort of intricate patterned fabric. So in the early 1800s, French weaver Joseph-Marie Jacquard built on earlier developments by others such as Jacques de Vaucanson to create the Jacquard punch card system for automatically controlling the warp. This was an early binary system, as the warp thread can either be lifted or not for each pass of the weft. The pattern would be originally drawn on paper, with crosses indicating where the thread would not be lifted. This was then translated into the punch cards which would be fed into the loom. If there was a hole, the mechanism would be able to lift the thread, but if there wasn't, then it was left behind, so the warp thread would be dominant in that place. This existing technology of having your binary input for various different things helped inspire some of the thinking of Babbage and Lovelace for the analytical engine, and eventually made its way to being input for early computer systems. My favourite example of weaving's influence on computing that I didn't know about until more recently is the core rope memory for the Apollo guidance computer. This was read-only memory that was created by physically weaving wires through tiny magnetic cores. It went through the core for a 1 bit and bypassed it for a 0. Inhibiting wires were used to control which of the cores were being read at any one time. Because they could thread dozens of sensing wires through each of the tiny little rings, they were able to store dense read-only programs in a very small space, which was incredibly limited on the Apollo spacecraft. So they could store more data, but it took months to weave a single program. But the fact that they were able to do this, I think, is genuinely quite amazing. So what about knitting? Why did I bring that up earlier? I personally find it really interesting to learn about where things come from and dive into the why to help me understand the what. I tried to learn programming several times in high school, and I just bounced off every time because I got thrown in the deep end. And it's been the same many times when I've tried to look at crafts as well. It wasn't until I decided to go back to study a general IT qualification after having my first child that I actually got my head around it, due to the first mandatory programming class actually breaking down the structure of how a program works. And that was what I needed for it to click. And when I started trying to knit things more complicated than just a scarf, and I wanted to alter the output I was going to get, I started thinking about all of the similarities. So, how many people do we have here that know how to knit? Awesome, we've got a few. So if I put a simple knitting pattern up on the screen, you guys might be able to read it. But if you don't know what you're looking at, it's going to seem kind of overwhelming and confusing. This is a fairly famous but actually quite simple pattern known as a fish and chip vest, which is often knitted for babies. One of my friends made one for my oldest son when he was much younger. It's quite a square and stretchy garment, but there's a lot of assumed knowledge here, even with some bits of extra instruction. But we can think about the component pieces that go into this to help make it easier to understand. So the way I look at it, we have a lot of things in knitting that could be thought of as language keywords and built-in functions. We have things like knit, purl, cast on, and cast off. They are the very basic instructions used in basically every pattern without any explanation. They're the foundation of everything else in the pattern, in the same way that a core of a programming language is to your own programs. Other common stitches will often have a brief explanation at the top of a pattern for general consumption to ensure they're understood, but for more advanced patterns this may be skipped if they expect that you might know what you're doing. So these are things like yarn overs, which get used to create holes, particularly in lace knitting, or decreases and increase stitches where you want to change how many stitches you're actually working with. There's also things like ribbing will often just be written as K1 purl 1 rib, and that means you're going to alternate knit and purls to create a much stretchier bit of fabric, which is often used for things like cuffs and neck holes. So I look at those as similar to the built-in functions of your core language libraries, aspects that are widely documented and understood and are available and provided to everyone who's working with these tools. They're very easy to come across and generally easy to understand. But maybe you want something more complicated. We could write a small function, define it at the top of the pattern. So many patterns I've seen have instructions for more complicated set of stitches at the top, so you can call it later in the pattern just referring to its name. Allows you to reuse your instructions without constantly repeating yourself, and it makes it easier to conceptualize the steps that you'll be taking as you go. Similar to how you may take parts of your code and turn them into a function to make reuse easier, or just to give it a useful name so that when you read it 5 months down the line, you remember what that complex piece of code was doing. So I once knitted a pattern you can see here that called it the daisy stitch. You're knitting several times into one loop to create something that looks a bit like a star. And if you tried to have that giant set of instructions every single time you wanted to do that daisy stitch, that's going to be a really confusing pattern to read. But if you define it once, and then you keep calling it, again, readability, understanding what is going on. But large functions, things get more complicated again. Patterns often tend to be broken down into sections. When you're knitting a more complex item, it will say, this is the instructions for the head, this is the body, this is a limb, and then this might be how you put it together at the end. For a sweater, it could be the yoke, which is the top part with the neck hole and your shoulders, where it splits into the sleeves, the main body. For women's sweaters, there might be different instructions for the bust area, particularly to allow for more modification. For a plushie, as shown, could be different sections of your item. If you only want to alter one aspect of the pattern, or one area of a program, understanding which piece and how to find it can make a really huge difference. If you want to change the length of a garment or the fit in an area, you can look to the instructions specific to that section of the pattern. Or if you realize that something has gone wrong with your output, being able to identify where the output has differed from the expectations can make it much easier to fix. Although with knitting it does tend to be human error following the instructions as opposed to giving them, there are a few patterns with bugs. I have seen some that have published errata to correct mistakes that were identified by people who were trying to follow them and noticed that it would always go wrong in this one spot. And these functions often will get called multiple times in a more complex pattern. You might be making 2 sleeves for a sweater, or 2 or more limbs for a plush toy, or maybe 8 tentacles for an octopus. But we've got loops as well in programs and in patterns. Repeat sections are very, very common to avoid constant repetition. So alongside calling your functions multiple times, it might just be, here's a small set, we're going to do it to the end of the row. Here's one row, do it 20 times. You will get to the end of it. You might find the section defined in square brackets, and so that will be what you're repeating. And there could be multiple different types of break conditions. End of the row, end of multiple sets, or even just do it 6 times. Sometimes these loops involve adding a small offset at the start, so that you end up with the sort of pattern that shifts slightly as you keep going. And that's something that you will see in programming as well. Sometimes you also see what are known as stitch markers to identify the places where the instructions will change or stop repeating, which you might think is sort of your rogue exit condition for your loop. And you can see some in my knitting picture just there, the little rainbow loops of thread. Oh no, I've lost my notes for this one. That is all good. We do also have control flow in patterns, so particularly for different sizes. Often a pattern will have just one block of text, and then you'll say, these are the different sizes, in brackets, if you want this size, you pick that one. If you want the next size, this one. And we'll have different sets of instructions to say, so you're making your decisions based on what size you want, but it's telling you inside, you want this, you're going down this path, in the same way that we have our control flow in our patterns. But my favorite example of putting all of these concepts together is when my son really wanted a Minecraft skeleton plushie for his birthday. But these things are really expensive to buy from the store, and I had the double whammy of being a poor student and a solo parent at that point, so I decided I was going to try and make one for him. But I couldn't find a pattern for a Minecraft skeleton plushie. I could find a pattern for a creeper plushie. So I had a look at them. Creepers and skeletons, they're pretty similar. They're blocky, they've got similar sections. Sure, skeletons have arms and creepers don't, but you're still looking at 4 limbs and some blocky sections and a head. So I ended up enlarging it slightly and modifying the sections, choosing different ones so that I could end up with an outcome that looked like a Minecraft skeleton. I kept everything as square as I could. Not so super happy with how the middle torso bit came out there, but the most important person absolutely loved it to pieces. That is literal. I didn't come up with a very good way to attach the arms, so they are falling off these days, but you still love it, don't you, bud? So there is one other big connection between programming and fibre arts that I want to highlight before we finish up, and it's the very reason that I am even standing here talking to you today. Both the modern fibre arts communities and the Python community have this wonderful focus on inclusivity and diversity that we have highlighted so many times already here. These topics are really important to me, as without other people putting that effort in, I would not be where I am today and able to do the things that I do. As mentioned, I didn't consider any form of IT as a career at first. Despite growing up attached to computers, I couldn't really see myself in the industry, and I'd bounced off a little bit a couple of times, and nobody had really helped me. Despite the early history of computing being full of amazing women and all sorts of people, the general vibe of IT is still that of a male-dominated one. It wasn't until after I'd had my first child and I wanted to get out of hospitality, where I'd kind of ended up, that I considered giving it another chance. I went back to study IT, and I finally had programming click for me. But as a neurodivergent solo parent, I still found it very hard to make it to any professional networking events or conferences like this. And that can be really important early in your career to help learn and network and grow and make all of these connections. The whole process seemed overwhelming to try and make it, particularly when I often needed to get home to make dinner or get the kids to bed. But the first time I came here to Kiwi PyCon, 2 years ago now in Christchurch, the inclusivity efforts really blew me away. I hope you have noticed them. And this community is full of people who truly feel comfortable being their true selves and able to participate. Everyone's efforts with mask wearing and making this a welcoming space make genuine differences to people's lives, and I want to make sure to thank you all. There may not be things like the low sensory room or childcare this year, but I know that's not for a lack of thought or desire from the conference organisers. When I first saw the fact that they had these things and they were thinking about them 2 years ago, it made me feel like the needs of people like myself had truly been considered, and I was actually accepted and welcomed and wanted in this space. And as I mentioned, I couldn't feel like I could justify making it to the events because I'd have to get someone else to babysit the kids, and I'm missing that time with them. But all of these efforts inspired me to submit a lightning talk to say thank you. And it was the first time I'd stood up in front of an unknown audience to deliver any form of talk, short or long or otherwise. And despite feeling like my intense nerves were obvious and completely forgetting how I was intending to end the talk, I was still blown away by the response that I received from everybody. I still even have a sticker on the back of my laptop here that was based upon it. It's probably too small for most of you to see, but it was based on the line, "When it comes to inclusivity, this is another place where explicit is better than implicit." Taking part in a panel at last year's PyCon and the continued amazing feedback from everybody really helped me find the confidence for public speaking and to submit this longer talk. I genuinely would not be here without the amazing effort and thought that so many people in this community continue to put in. It's not just here at Kiwi PyCon though. The Python community all around the world is genuinely wonderful. I gave a version of this talk at PyCon US earlier in the year as well, and it was such a great opportunity to see more of how awesome the rest of the global Python community is. They had all of these different ribbons to serve the same functions as our social indicator stickers, as well as indicating what your level of involvement in the conference was, the quiet space for those who needed it. And again, the diverse group of people that you get to meet and know is just truly inspiring at conferences like this one. I ended up attending a couple of open spaces, which were small meetups just organised by random attendees during the conference, particularly ones for just gathering queer and neurodivergent Pythonistas. And it was really amazing getting to meet all of these different people with similar challenges from around the world. And just the way that we all vibed and cracked up at silly neurodivergent jokes was honestly just wonderful. We ended up making a Discord for neurodivergent Pythonistas, so if anybody is interested in joining, feel free to reach out. We'd love to get more people and activity going in that space. Because we really got to meet and learn about stories and challenges and triumphs and all sorts of things that people in these different sort of converging communities can do and support each other. It was also great to see some of the different groups that exist in the community to help promote the participation of underrepresented groups in larger spaces, such as PyLadies and its various chapters around the world, and the Black Python Devs group that I saw there. It's the effort of everybody that gets involved in these things that make the community truly great and wonderful. I do see many similar efforts within the fibre arts communities as well, both online and with the conventions that they organise. The conventions could seem quite similar to what we've got going on here, often containing a mix of tutorial sessions, as well as booths to purchase supplies such as yarn and crafting tools. The community is also full of wonderful people being and expressing their true selves and sharing this with the wider world to help improve things for others. One thing that I quite like about sort of the online fibre arts communities is the push for size-inclusive patterns that a lot of smaller designers will go for. Because when you're going to a lot of ready-to-wear clothes on the shelves, it can be really hard to find stuff that fits you if you're not just the standard body type that the companies like to put stuff out there for. So patterns that have really big ranges of sizes and include instructions on how to modify them in order to fit yourself can be really sort of confidence empowering for a lot of people to feel like, hey, I can make myself clothes that fit. I can make things for me that just give me all of this confidence and make me feel wonderful in myself. And I think that's truly an amazing ability to be able to have. So again, I want to thank everybody that cares and puts the effort into making sure that as many people as possible feel welcome and able to participate in these things. We create a better world by ensuring that everyone is supported to have their best outcomes and is able to feel valued and included, no matter what their contributions may be able to be. So, some conclusions. Understanding the links and commonalities you may have with other people, other communities, other hobbies, can really help with understanding and appreciating the different perspectives we all have. It can help with problem solving, with communication and collaboration, which are really important things in our field. Bringing in these different perspectives or finding different ways to look at a problem can truly help you come up with innovative approaches or even just solve something that seemed impossible in the first place. But also understanding how things work. What is their why? How can we tease it apart and put it back together again is a very useful skill when it comes to being a software engineer and working with technology. But applying it to other situations or hobbies can help you gain new perspectives on what is going on in your digital realm as well. So can understanding where things came from and how they actually grew into what we have today. Enjoying digging into the background and history of things has definitely helped me when trying to debug or untangle a pile of inherited spaghetti code. Truly, digging a little bit into the weeds can really help there sometimes. And as I mentioned, knitting is fun, and it can be a really satisfying hobby, once you're past the inevitably awkward early stages. It can be very easy to pick up and put down when needed, and you have something physical to show for your efforts at the end, which, as someone who works primarily in the digital realm, is a very nice thing to produce on occasion, particularly if you know people who appreciate the care and effort that goes into handmade gifts. So, I hope this talk has been able to give you an interesting new perspective on things and help highlight some connections that you may have been unaware that you've actually got with other people out there. Ngā mihi nui, kia pai tō rā. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for that. I learned something in this. The interfacing thing. The layers of the fabric and the thing that makes it all puffy and cool. Interfaces. I have a cube. Who has a question?
Do you ever have multiple threads? Flat piece? This piece?
Yes.
Oh yeah. Do you ever have multiple threads of execution? You know, you are knitting, but it's one thread. You're going around the outside of the garment. Do you ever have?
I mean, as an ADHD brain, I'm usually knitting and watching and talking and multiple things like that going on at once.
I mean, on the garment itself, you're knitting here, right?
I mean,
and
if you're
also
doing
knitting on that part of the garment.
It's hard to do that with only two hands because you need both hands for knitting, but you will have often multiple threads going on if you're doing colour work, so using multiple colours as well. There's multiple ways of doing that. One called intarsia, you could consider like that because you just have the threads dangling off all over the place and you pick it up when you get back to it in the same way the CPU does.
Yes, so it's actually, it's more like async I/O.
Yeah, but possibly.
So knitting is really cool. Have you started entering the world of weaving yet?
Oh, see, the main reason I haven't is I don't have space for a loom. I had a friend who had a big proper-sized loom and wove baby wraps and things when both of our kids were small, and it was amazing, but I also went, I do not have space for this. I like my knitting, which is portable, and I can put it down. Close.
So do you ever use Python or other computer tools in designing your knitwear?
I haven't so far, but I know there are people out there that do. There was a really interesting talk given at last year's PyCon US, not about knitting, but using Python to design files for embroidery machines so that you could actually have some interesting patterns and things going on there, and then feed that into the embroidery machine and have it actually sewn onto the garment. And I managed to meet them there earlier in the year, and they were wearing some of the things they'd embroidered with Python, and it was really cool to see. Bye.
Thank you. Excellent talk. I too am a fibre enthusiast. On what side of the knitting versus crochet war do you sit?
I am personally a knitter, but that's because the time I tried to pick up crochet, I ended up bouncing off. I keep meaning to go back to it. I know some people who are very fond of doing both, but I don't know, for some reason knitting's just made more sense in my head so far.
I'll play off that one. So you've mentioned that you initially bounced off computing and you've bounced off crochet.
Yep.
What is it, or is there anything that we can learn about the why knitting, you attached to knitting the first time off and you have attached to computing the second time round, that either the crochet community or us more generally as a computing community could learn from the experience of getting new people on board?
Yeah, I mean, that's also something that's quite important to me. I mean, knitting, again, it didn't click completely the first time, but I think one of the things is just not throwing people in the deep end and going, you'll be fine, here's everything, because that's overwhelming. And that was the problem I had the first times I've tried to approach most of these, and it probably is the issue I've had with crochet, is that I find too much information and I haven't found the place to start, really. And so that was what I needed with programming, was the first few times all of my friends were like, just throw yourself in the deep end, here's everything, you'll do great. And it didn't work for me. It was when the logical concepts were sort of introduced and I was like, oh, okay, this is what we're actually trying to do. Now it makes sense to me. I get the why rather than just having all of the what dumped on me at once. One more.
What are you currently knitting?
I've been trying to knit myself some wrist warmers, but the little one down there keeps saying he wants his own ones, so I might have to pause those and do those first.